Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Russia and the U.S. have come to an agreement that they say will prevent incidents between one another during their respective bombing campaigns in Syria, an understanding which they are claiming does not amount to strategic coordination. Let's have a look at what Pentagon spokesperson Peter Cook had to say about the agreement and what it won't be doing.
The MOU does not establish zones of cooperation, intelligence sharing, or any sharing of target information in Syria. The discussions through which this MOU was developed do not constitute U.S. cooperation or support for Russia's policy or actions in Syria. In fact, far from it, we continue to believe that Russia's strategy in Syria is counterproductive, and their support for the Assad regime will only make Syria's civil war worse.
The news comes on the same day that the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff arrived in Iraq to assess the campaign and their fight against the IS there. And this is days after reports have come out that more U.S.-made weapons are flooding into Syria from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to resupply rebels opposed to Assad. Now joining me to discuss these developments is Sergei M. Plekhanov. He's an associate professor of political science at York University and a former deputy director of the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies in Russia. Sergei, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So give us an assessment of why this particular memorandum was required and what you make of the agreement.
Well, there is an acute practical need to avoid possibilities of direct clashes between Russian Air Force and U.S. Air Force. It's a small place, the fighter planes fly very fast, and we've seen a number of instances in recent weeks when there were dangerous situations, alleged incursions by Russian planes into the Turkish airspace. A drone was downed a couple of days ago. It's not clear who it belongs to, but it was definitely made in Russia and so on. So both Russia and the United States operate their air forces in the airspace above the battleground in Syria. Since both sides have an interest in defeating ISIS, even though they also have opposite goals in other respects, they need to have at least a minimum of coordination, at least communication, in order to be able to avoid, inadvertent direct clashes. So from the military standpoint, it's a good thing because it makes the situation somewhat less dangerous. I must say that it was the Russians who were actually advocating some forms of coordination and cooperation between the militaries of the two sides. So finally, some agreement has been reached, but it's interesting that the Pentagon is emphasizing how it is actually not cooperating with the Russians, even though, in fact, they're making the first step to cooperate with them. I know at ISIS headquarters, they must be bursting into applause, saying, oh, we thought the Russians and the Americans are joining forces against us. Now it turns out they're not. They're just minimizing the possibilities of war between them.
Now, you may have seen a Washington Post article last week that was alleging that these heavily equipped tanks that the United States was providing to the rebels on the ground in Syria was being taken out by the Russian bombs. What is that dispute all about, and why were the Russians taking out these tanks?
First of all, what's really happening on the ground and what we read about it in the media may be two different realities. So it's very difficult to comment on reports about events on the ground, given the fact that this is a situation where information warfare is just as acute as the real warfare. But it seems that the Russians are, on the one hand, trying to defeat ISIS and have been rather effective. Their planes have flown something like 300 sorties, maybe more. hitting various targets belonging to ISIS, but also targets belonging to other jihadist groups, like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is competing with ISIS, which are primarily about overthrowing the Assad regime. Now, the United States also has an interest, and in fact has been trying to accomplish the goal of removing Assad from power and replacing him with some other regime, which would can be expected to be pro-American. But the problem with that has been that every time the Americans try to conjure up, invoke, or support some kind of so-called moderate opposition to ISIS, to Assad, it turns out that the arms tend to get into the hands of another radical Islamist group. And so the real fighting is done not by these shadowy moderate groups, but by jihadists, radical jihadists. And that's how ISIS became as powerful as it was. And that's how it managed to gain so much territory, taking advantage of the United States' continuing policy to overthrow the Assad regime. So the Russians got involved because the Assad regime, in fact, they have a kind of an alliance relationship, or at least a client relationship with the Assad regime. The Assad regime asked Russia for assistance. The Syrian government, which is Assad regime, that's the Syrian government, which is recognized by other countries and which has a legitimate status in the country, no matter what the nature of that regime is. So Syria asked Russia for military assistance. The Russians have rendered that assistance by deploying their air force there. And they're doing that because their main goal is to prevent the formation of a big base for radical Islamist jihadist activity, which is now organized primarily under the rubric of ISIS, which would be threatening the southern areas of Russia as well as the Central Asian states. Not to mention Afghanistan, by the way, where ISIS now has a base too. So as far as fighting ISIS is concerned, Russia and the United States have a common interest. Problem is that because their interests with regard to the Assad regime are not the same, in fact, they are at odds with each other, they cannot cooperate effectively enough. So that creates a situation which only helps ISIS.
Now, if the objective of the Russians is really to fight ISIS and other rebel forces on the ground that is threatening the geopolitical stability of the world at this moment, if that's the real objective here, then why aren't they in greater cooperation? Like, even after signing this agreement, both sides issued statements on what it does not contain, not addressing what is necessary at this point, a real collaboration in terms of bringing about a solution on the ground, a regional solution to the issue of Syria.
Well, the main bone of contention is, of course, the fate of the Assad regime. Putin offered Americans a deal. Let's construct an anti-ISIS coalition in the Middle East. So a broad-based coalition, which includes both Russia's friends and America's friends in the Middle East, and let's defeat ISIS. And in the meantime, let's work on the political transition in Syria. Russians are not beholden to the Assad regime, but currently that's the regime that is fighting the Islamists and ISIS in the first place. And so helping the Assad regime is absolutely necessary in order to defeat that enemy. Military actions in Syria hitting those groups which the United States does not regard as bad guys. In fact, some of them might be pro-American good guys. But from the point of view of the Syrian government and the Russians, they are bad guys. So there is a big disagreement as to whom to hit and whom not to hit.
Now, if you were to take into consideration the real safety and security of the Syrian people, and you want to bring about a solution to the refugee and the migrant crisis in Syria, what's wrong with at least temporarily removing the Assad factor in order to bring about some calm and stability on the ground?
You remove the only government that exists in order to provide the conditions for stability? We've seen it in Libya. We've seen it in other places. this government still has control of a large part of the country. By the way, when they show you on the map that half of the territory or even more is under the control of ISIS, you shouldn't forget that 90% of that territory is desert. Whereas the majority of the populated areas of Syria are under the control of the government in Damascus. And it has an army, and that government also has recently been more successful in pushing back its opponents and ISIS in the first place. So it is totally unrealistic to expect that if we have a deal now where we tell President Sadat, okay, I have to go, and that means top generals will also have to go, the security forces will have to go, ISIS will be applauding because, yeah, sure, yeah, give us the vacuum, we'll just move in. And then there'll be an even bigger flow of refugees now from the remainder of the Syrians.
Now,
No, you need to prop up the government in its fight against the most dangerous force that has emerged out of the chaos of the Middle East, in the Middle East of the past years. And for that, and that does not make you beholden to this regime, because it's obvious to anyone that there will have to be a lot of political change in Syria. Maybe some kind of federation will be created in order to accommodate the various diverse groups of the Syrian population. Some kind of a regional pact will have to be concluded between the countries which are now at odds with each other. But all that can only be done after this malignant tumor has been removed. And the tumor is called ISIS or ISIL.
Now, some legitimate social movements and organizations in Syria are alleging that Assad is responsible for the death of over 200,000 people. Now, what is Russia doing with that information? Are they ignoring it?
Well, first of all, this is an allegation, not information. Again, this is information warfare. It could be more, it could be less. This government has been, this is a dictatorship in Syria, right? Does it mean that every dictatorship that exists, even though it is involved in this kind of a civil war, that it must be overthrown because it's a dictatorship? I don't think that this kind of blind approach to any kind of a civil war or domestic conflict that exists, especially in a country in the Middle East, should evoke automatic responses. Let's go and overthrow them. We've seen that. We've done that. The West has done that since 2003 with disastrous results. If George Bush had not overthrown the Saddam Hussein regime, and that was a bad regime, which was using chemical weapons, terrorizing its opponents, and then, invading Iran, by the way, with American backing. So that was a bad regime, but okay, we overthrew it. Do we have a flourishing democracy in Iraq? Northern Iraq has turned into a massive base for a new form and more dangerous form of radical jihadism. And we've seen the same in Libya. And we are now seeing the same in Syria. And we're not learning any lessons. I mean, are we pursuing human rights agenda in a situation which totally does not fit that agenda?
Now, Sergei, your Russian colleagues, you have many over the years that you've been studying Russian foreign policy with. What are they saying about a potential solution for the conflict in Syria?
Well, the solution, there is a sequence. It all depends on where one stands politically, and in Russia you have a political spectrum. There are bitter opponents of the Putin regime who are now criticizing him for getting involved in Syria. There is a possibility of a quagmire. The Russian public opinion is definitely not in favor of Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict. They say, hey, why should we be there? Why should we care, and so on. So there are critics of the government. There are some think tank people who are warning against the dangers of involvement in Syria. It is a risky game for the Russian government. But those who support the policy of the Russian government, what they're saying is that the top priority is defeating ISIS. And in fact, there is a wide area of common interest in that goal between Russia, the United States, Western Europe, key states in the Middle East, including Sunni states, at least some Sunni states. For instance, for Egypt, the Egyptians have not criticized Russia's actions in Syria because they share concern about the growth of a new form of radical Islamism in the region. They have been battling radical Islamists in their own country for quite a while, and they in Egypt there are some groups, ISIL connected groups, which have been operating. So the idea is to create some kind of a coalition, at least temporarily, in order to deal with this threat, defeating it militarily. There's no way. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission between the opposing sides in that conflict. So in the meantime, one should start negotiations or continue negotiations and discussions about some kind of a political transition in Syria, which would help remove the sources of the conflict, of the civil conflict that exploded originally because of the way the Syrian government responded to demonstrations against it. So there has to be a sequence of priority. First, you resolve the military problem, then you deal with political resolution. I think that some kind of a regional pact to stabilize Syria and make sure, and by the way, also Iraq, because Iraq has been affected by this crisis in a big way. It's not just about Syria. We're looking at the wide territory in the Middle East, which has been affected by this crisis. And so there have to be some regional solutions, which are only possible if the major players, such as Russia and the United States, operate with a reasonable degree of cooperation, not treating it as a zero-sum game where they pursue opposing goals, because otherwise only ISIS will benefit.
All right, Sergei, we would like to take that issue up of what a regional solution would look like in our next segment with you.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.